You're listening to the Jersey Guys Podcast, the show that talks about hard rock, heavy metal, AOR, and West Coast music. In-depth conversation and special guests are always on tap, so settle in and turn it up. Now, here are your hosts, Tom and Mark.
Hey everybody, this is Mark Ballo. Welcome to the Jersey Guys Podcast. We're here with my co-host Tom Coyne, and welcome to episode number 4. Today we are going to talk about the Michael Schenker Group, and we're going to talk about when Tom and I discussed doing this, we said, you know, Michael Schenker's got a long history, obviously, but we said let's kind of focus on the first half of his career as the Michael Schenker Group, and we would go up and cover the first 7 albums. And basically that was at the point in the mid-90s when he returned to UFO and recorded a new album with them. So we're going to cover the first 7 albums of the Michael Schenker discography. And we're going to start from album number 1 and let's get right into it. So what do you think, Tom? Album number 1, 1980, Michael Schenker. He has that long history with UFO. He plays shortly in 1979 with the Scorpions and his brother. And then he goes solo. So now here we are, 1980, he releases the Michael Schenker Group.
Well, this was a much anticipated record. There had been a lot of talk at the time that he was going to put out a solo record, and it was kind of a disjointed period for him because he had left UFO in the very late part of the 70s. Paul Chapman came in, Schenker returned. After the Obsession album had already been recorded, finished the tour. He, as you said, was instrumental in the Love Drive album with the Scorpions in 79, and it was around that period that this record was recorded, the debut. It was done primarily by studio musicians. It was before the vintage lineup was in place, which was still yet to come.
Sure. Now, this album has Don Airey on keyboards, and Simon Phillips is the drummer, and Mo Foster on bass.
Correct.
And this album was produced by Roger Glover of Deep Purple fame, of course.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, what are your opinions on the first album?
I like it. I never loved it from the time that I got it up until currently. It's a good record, had a couple of great songs. It was kind of a precursor of what was yet to come. So kind of similar to when we did the Europe discography and we went over the first Europe album. I think we had the same feelings of it. It wasn't really the lineup that he was going to shine with, and the songwriting was there. It was a lot of instrumental pieces. There was some great shredding. If you're a Michael Schenker aficionado and like his more shred-festing playing, he did do a lot of heavy-duty playing on this album.
Sure. Yeah, you had Armed and Ready, Cry for the Nations,
those
Victim
2 best
of
songs
Illusion.
of the album, I thought.
They were actually the 2 singles from the album,
yeah.
if I can remember correctly. And Victim of Illusion, I love that song. It's probably my favorite on the record.
Yeah, that's a good song.
Yeah. But I myself, like, I don't really... I wasn't turned on to the band at that point. 1980, I really wasn't aware of Michael Schenker. My awareness to Michael Schenker and the Michael Schenker Group came a little bit later when he teamed up with Robin McAuley. We'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, he had some success with the first album, obviously, and that's 1980, and then quickly moves on. Oh, and we got to mention too, I mean, the singer, Gary Barton, you know, he came from where? He was in State Trooper?
Well, State Trooper actually came out after the first Michael Schenker album. It was more in the later period of the new wave of British heavy metal. This was like his first big gig was with on the first Schenker album. Barton is an interesting singer. I've always liked his vocals, and I really, out of everybody, and this includes Graham Bonnet, it includes Robin McAuley, I always felt Barton was the voice of Michael Schenker. And he didn't have a technically great voice. He was sometimes a little wavering live. I liked his voice, and it was, to me, I always felt was the voice of Schenker, and I got to see him numerous times with Michael Schenker throughout different periods of the career.
Yeah. I mentioned to you earlier, and I said I don't know if I was crazy or what, but I don't know, listening to the albums again, these albums with Gary Barton on them just recently as we were preparing for this podcast, I don't know, something I heard a little bit of like almost a Rob Halford sort of style or quality to his voice. I don't know. I mean, you said you didn't really hear it as much.
I didn't really hear that. I mean, other than the only connection that we spoke about before we went on the record with this podcast was that Simon Phillips was in Judas Priest for a period of time, but I don't know if that had any impact on it at all. But I never really heard Halford in his voice. Barton, to me, always had a voice that was kind of unto himself. You know it's him when he sings.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought, I don't know why, especially on the song Victim of Illusion, I thought the song itself had, even the guitar riff that Michael Schenker came up with was kind of like a little bit Judas Priest sounding to me, and maybe that's where I kind of picked up on that.
Well, that album, I thought, had some of Schenker's more aggressive playing than I had heard in a long time, and even what was yet to come. If I had to pick out of all the albums that Schenker did through the 80s into the early 90s, it's got some of his best playing is on that album. I just think the songwriting wasn't, as a full album, what was yet to come because of the guys that he surrounded himself with going forward.
Right. Well, now that would bring us to album number 2, which came quickly the year after, 1981. We have, I guess you would call it the self-titled or MSG album. That one came out in like 1981. I said, now you've got Gary Barton returning on vocals, but you now have, and the lineup you talked about, you now add guys like Paul Raymond, you add Cozy Powell on drums, and Chris Glenn, longtime bass player, with Michael Schenker. So this is kind of like the solidified lineup of the band, right?
Yes, I think people that are really into MSG, at least the early period of it, this is what we look at as the perfect Schenker lineup, and I think it was the perfect Schenker album. I don't think he's ever done an album as good as this before or after. I think I'll probably get some flack on this. I think it might be better than a lot of the UFO albums that he was on. It was, in my opinion, a landmark album of its time. I think it's dated extremely well 40 years after the fact. The songwriting was incredible. The playing, it's a perfect 10.
Yeah. I mean, you had songs like Ready to Rock. You had Attack of the Mad Axeman. On and On, which is probably my favorite song on the record. As crazy as that
Never
might
Trust
sound.
a Stranger, Looking for Love.
Oh, yeah. Let Sleeping Dogs Lie.
Secondary Motion, which is a great song.
Yeah.
Let Sleeping Dogs Lie.
Let Sleeping Dogs Lie to me had a little bit of a purple, deep purple kind of feel to it.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. I thought that was a pretty good song. I like the album a lot. Like you said, I mean, when you talk about the lineup, you can't complain about any of those players that he brought into the band at that point. And so, yeah, that probably was the classic, or maybe the best lineup of his career as far as the Michael Schenker albums go.
I don't think he ever did a record, and again, this includes UFO records too. I don't think he's ever done a record this perfect. Every song was great. Different styles of songs. It's a perfect 10 in my book. This record, it's that good.
Now he's basically, I mean, he's kind of riding on a high in a way. I mean, it was like rapid fire. I mean, the first album comes out in 1980, follows that up with the MSG album, 1981, and now you're going right into 1982, and you got Assault Attack. But now there's a change in the band at that point, a big change, because Gary Barton exits and Graham Bonnet, the legendary Graham Bonnet, comes in. There's a couple other changes. Ted McKenna took over for Cozy Powell on drums, and then you had Tommy Iyer on keyboards for this, replacing the Paul Raymond. So Yeah, talk about Assault Attack, because you got the third album into their career now, and you got a new singer.
Well, McKenna came on board because he was in Alex Harvey's band along with Chris Glenn. Cozy at that point was, he was in demand by every big British rock band. I mean, we know he's cut through Gary Moore, he's cut through Whitesnake, Msg, so there was a change in drumming. They changed singers, and I know there was some issues between Schenker and Barton. I'm not going to speculate what, because it was never really put out there specifically, but Bonnet was a guy that was still kind of the beginning stages of the legend of Graham Bonnet, but obviously he had his stint in Rainbow, which was successful, even though it didn't end on a great note for him. And he had that over-the-top style of singing that was really first evidenced in Rainbow, and it attracted Schenker in the direction he wanted to go, because it was probably the heaviest record. Might be the heaviest record that Schenker has ever recorded. It's got some really heavy, for that time, heavy songs with a gigantic production, great playing, and Bonnet. This was the first album, in my opinion, that Bonnet really set the stage for what a over-the-top, signature voice that he had. And I would rate this album maybe not quite on par with the second album, but it's right there.
Right.
And the production, courtesy of Martin Birch, I believe.
Yes, Martin Birch.
Yeah, it was a big step up from the prior Msg albums. The production alone may have set it on a different level. But it was a great record. Samurai, Desert Song.
Desert Song is probably my favorite on the album. Even a song like Dancer, to me, like, it had like a real Alcatraz kind of feel to it almost, in a way, which is kind of something that Bonnet went on to. But
it did. It's probably my least favorite track on the album, but it definitely did have some Alcatraz vibes. Broken Promises was another one deeper track on the Assault Attack. It was a great record. I remember when this record came out, it was, if you were into this music at time, this record got your attention big time.
Now, it's funny because an instrumental song on this album, on Assault Attack, was a song called Ulcer, right?
Yes.
And I can't help but, when I was listening to it, I kind of laughed to myself, because I thought to myself, maybe that was Michael Schenker's dedication to Graham Bonnet, right? Because, I mean, when they started touring for this album, Bonnet made it only one show before he was out the door.
Yeah, there were problems with Bonnet. I mean, Bonnet had problems with Richie Blackmore. Bonnet was a handful. Bonnet needed his own band. He needed guys to dance to his tune, so to speak. There were definitely problems with him, with substance abuse, alcohol, a whole myriad of problems, some of which, reared their heads in Rainbow also. That being said, I mean, Bonnet, at any time I had seen him live or seen videos of him, performed really well, but I know there were major issues at that time with him and Schenker, and he was sacked on a live setting very quickly, and which led to the return of old reliable Gary Barton.
Right. Now, right after the Assault Attack album, the band released One Night in Budokan, which was a live album, obviously, and that came out in 1982. That was recorded in 1981 with that lineup we spoke of, Cozy Powell on drums, and more of that more classic lineup, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're not really going to talk too much about the live album. Live albums are live albums. We thought we would stick pretty much to the studio releases of the band. So after you have the live album One Night in Budokan, you then come up to 1983, and you have the fourth album in the band's history, and Gary Barton, as you mentioned a minute ago, comes back into the fold. Then you have the album Built to Destroy.
A big personal favorite of mine, and I know it's in the whole parlance of the Michael Schenker discography. It's kind of met with mixed feelings, but me personally, I always loved this record. I thought the songwriting was extremely strong. It wasn't maybe one of Schenker's big showcase guitar albums, but I thought the songwriting was very, very strong. Red Sky, Rock My Nights Away, which is a song I just absolutely have always loved.
Yeah. Rock Will Never Die.
Rock Will Never Die, Dogs of War.
The classic instrumental Captain Nemo.
Captain Nemo, Make You Mine, which is another song. I just thought that this record had great songwriting. And for me personally, as much as I love Graham Bonnet, it was just equally as a welcome return to have Gary Barton back. And I was a big fan of this record.
I think, Red Sky was probably my favorite track on the album.
Rock My Nights Away is one of my favorite Michael Schenker songs.
Okay. So then now we're 1983. Gary Barton's back in the mix. They put another live album out, right? Which was Rock Will Never Die, which came out in 1984.
84, correct.
Yeah. So they do that. Then now there's kind of like I guess you could call it the classic era of the Michael Schenker Group kind of comes to an end, right?
Yes, that was the end of it. And I liked Built to Destroy so much that I was really thinking there would be an album after it, but there was not. That was, I guess, a period of 84 going into 85.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big change about to happen for Michael Schenker.
Oh, definitely. Now, what happened basically was 1987, a couple years down the line now, and Michael Schenker brings in Robin McAuley on vocals now, right? And the band now changes the moniker to the McAuley Schenker Group. Still MSG, obviously, but now it's the McAuley Schenker Group. So it's kind of like you're featuring Robin McAuley, and now the band puts out the album Perfect Timing, the first album with Robin McAuley. Totally new lineup of players. You've got, in addition to McAuley on vocals, you've got Mitch Perry on guitars, you've got Rocky Newton on bass, Bodo Schopf on drums, and Steve Mann even does keyboards and some guitars. So this is like the new era of the Michael Schenker Group, but it's now the McAuley Schenker Group, right?
Yeah, this was a big change, and I remember this was something that was talked about. I read a lot about what was coming with Schenker, and what I started to really have a whole different appreciation for Michael Schenker is that he totally reinvented himself. He seemed extremely comfortable in who he was. He didn't have to be a guitar god anymore. He didn't act like a guitar god. In fact, he went and brought in another lead guitar player into the band who was an accomplished player in Mitch Perry, mm-hmm. who had stints with Talus, who had a stint with Heaven. In fact, he was on what I think was the best Heaven album. And Schenker didn't have to bring in a guitar player of that caliber, but he did, because he was at that time all about the songwriting and having the best band he could put out there. And he brought in McAuley, which at that time was pretty much a virtual unknown to most people, unless you really had your ear, to the ground on the UK and European scene and knew him from Grand Prix and GMT. He was an unknown, and he not only brought him in, he made him part of the band. I mean, he was, the MSG turned into McAuley Schenker.
Right. And
he had no problems, taking a backseat to Robin McAuley's name. He had no problems sharing the spotlight with Mitch Perry. He brought in Rocky Newton from Lionheart fame. Mm-hmm. And that was a tremendous band. I would say that band was on par with the first big incarnation of MSG back when he had Paul Raymond and Cozy and Chris Glenn. And it was a more melodic rock, almost AOR type of an album with incredible songs. I mean, again, an album that had nothing weak on it, and it was just such a maturation of Michael Schenker, because he seemed very at peace with not having to play Guitar God. And
Right.
he was just, if you saw videos of that band or live footage of that band, he was kind of a guy that was just in the band, and he seemed very at peace with that. Macaulay had a big part, Mitch Perry had a big part, and he seemed very at ease with that, and the songwriting was great, and Macaulay was that was the first introduction to the masses, and certainly the United States, of what a talent Robin Macaulay.
Oh yeah,
was.
that's where I kind of definitely became, and I mentioned before how I wasn't really turned on to the earlier Michael Schenker albums, but I kind of 1987 at this point, the MTV era, I was turned on to Perfect Timing. Was my first introduction to Michael Schenker, to be honest, and I just love Robin Macaulay's voice. And I thought it was a great album. And like you said, it was interesting because what Michael Schenker did was he was playing more, it was more about the song. And it wasn't, like you
Absolutely.
said, him needing to be the guitar hero. So I think that, and you clearly see that on the songs. I mean, the solos weren't anything that needed to be the central part of the song. It was more about the song itself.
I wish Schenker had stayed really with this blueprint longer, and with Mitch Perry in the band, because to me, this was a great place for him. I really loved this record. I loved who he was and the direction that he was headed with this lineup in this record.
Oh, yeah, totally. And that's 1987. So then 2 years goes by, and now 1989 comes along, and we get the second Macaulay Schenker album, which is Save Yourself. And it's basically the same lineup, except Mitch Perry now leaves, right?
Right. Mitch Perry had left, and I liked this record. I never loved it. I thought it was spotty. I thought overall there were a couple of great songs. There was some throwaway songs, which I kind of thought coming off the record before it was a letdown. It's certainly by no stretch of the imagination a bad record. It was. It was called Save Yourself, and what saved the record was there was a couple of really, really, high-end tunes on it.
Yeah, probably the band, I mean, I guess the Macaulay Schenker era is probably the biggest hit they ever had in any time, right? That song.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably, I would say, if you had to ask me, I would say that's probably my favorite song of that Macaulay Schenker era. That was just, and it's a song that's still, you play it on XM today, it's still heard nowadays. And it's just a great song. It's an epic song, actually.
Honestly, I think it saved that record.
Yeah.
I mean, there are songs like Bad Boys was okay. I mean, a little cliche. There was songs on that album that I thought, songwriting-wise, the band was going backwards.
Yeah.
It just wasn't as cohesive. It wasn't as melodic. And again, like I said, I thought it had a couple of throwaway songs on it. It was not a bad album. I'm not trying to say it's a bad album.
Yeah.
I just didn't like it as much as the predecessor.
Yeah, I mean, you had a song like, the title track, Save Yourself, which is a real heavy
I like Save
song.
Yourself, but I had no problem with him going in that direction.
Yeah.
Heavier as opposed to the other album, because certainly he's done heavier stuff.
Yeah.
But I just thought the songwriting overall was a disappointment from the album before.
Yeah, I thought I mean, there's a handful of songs on that album that I really liked. I liked This Is My Heart, Destiny, Take Me Back. I maybe the second half of the album maybe got a little bit stronger in that respect.
It did, yeah.
Yeah, so I like the album, and I gotta say, probably my favorite album cover of the Macaulay Schenker, or maybe of the Michael Schenker era, might be the Save Yourself album cover. I thought it had great artwork.
Yeah, well, because the one before it and the one after were kind of, the album covers were.
Well, on Perfect Timing, we got to see the super mullet of Robin Macaulay.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So that was pretty cool. But yeah, but now 2 years pass again, and we're now into the 90s, and it's 1991, and now the last Macaulay Schenker Group album comes out, which, funny enough, it's titled MSG, again, just like the band's second album. So now that's 1991. You've got a completely new band again. You've got Jeff Pilson on bass, James Kotak on drums, and Jesse Harms on keyboards, right?
Right.
So that's now, how do you feel about that album coming off something like Save Yourself, which wasn't...
Well, I like that album a lot. I thought it was it was more in line with the first album with MSG when they reformed. It was more melodic. Some of the songs were, I thought, on par, like Eve and Paradise. Yeah, Paradise is good. We Believe.
When I'm Gone.
Right. What Happens to Me. There was really good songs on that album. I like that album a lot. I mean, that turned out to be kind of the end of the era because he got back to UFO a few years after that. But I like that record a lot. It was very solid.
Right. Well, I thought that's where when we talked about this leading up to doing this podcast about the Michael Schenker Group discography, and we said, his career sort of paused after the MSG self-titled album in 1991. They did the shows with that, the tour with it. He ended up doing an acoustic album right after that in 92? Yeah. And that was kind of the end of the Macaulay Schenker era. It was actually kind of the end of the Michael Schenker Group for a short period because he ended up going back to UFO, right? In the mid-90s, recorded an album with them, like I mentioned earlier. That didn't last too long, though. He did a short kind of tour with them, another blow-up, and then he's back.
And then he returned. They did two albums after that. The first one was Walk on Water. I mean, that's the UFO we could do for another day, but
right.
Yeah, just briefly on that, I was never wild about any of those UFO records. That when he returned, I thought the first one, Walk on Water, was good. The two after it, I thought was spotty. I don't know how, in retrospect, I don't know how forced that reformation was.
Right.
I don't know if it was a cash grab. I always kind of felt that in retrospect. I look back on it. I think it probably was because Mog has really never had periods where he's put out records that lacked in songwriting, and some of those UFO albums I really thought did. And him and Schenker, I don't have to go into the love-hate, leaning on more hate back then,
right,
relationship they've had. So I was never huge on those records. Maybe the first one I thought was solid. The other two, not so solid.
Yeah. Well, now he did kind of continue and brought the Michael Schenker Group back into existence after that. We talked about this, and we could have went on and covered these albums too, but he did do, since 1996, when he put out the Written in Sand album, has done 7 more Michael Schenker Group albums since then, culminating in actually the one that came out just this year in 2021 titled Immortal. I'll run down those albums real quick for everybody. You had Written in Sand in 1996. That featured vocalist Leif Sundin. You had The Unforgiven in 1999 with Kelly Keeling on vocals. You had Beware of Scorpions in 2001. That had Chris Logan on vocals. And then you had Arachnophobiac in 2003, which had Chris Logan again on vocals. And then I guess at that point things became even a little more convoluted in the career of the Michael Schenker Group, because you had Tales of Rock and Roll in 2006. And now that album had primary vocalist was Yari Tiora, I believe it's pronounced, and he also brought back all the previous singers from the band, right? Gary Barton and Macaulay, and
right,
and Bonnet came in and they all did like a song or so. And then in 2008, he did In the Mist of Beauty, and that had Gary Barton actually back in the mix. But we were talking earlier, it's not really a great album. The songs severely lack. Very spotty, more on probably completely spotty, actually. And then, again, we said he's up to earlier this year, he releases Immortal. And that album, again, goes with a whole plethora of singers. You have guys like Jolyn Turner, Ronnie Romero, Ralph Sheepers from Primal Fear, Michael Voss. Comes in, and then I think even there's a song with like Doogie White, Macaulay, and Barton back on it. So it got real convoluted, and we could have made a 2-hour podcast if we had to go and talk about all those albums and the different singers on them. So that's why we thought we would cut it off after the first 7 albums, right?
Well, what I could say about all those records is Written in Sand, I was a big fan of. I liked Leif Sundin. I knew him from Swedish band called Great King Rat that he was in.
Yes.
And that record did not get very good distribution at the time. I remember it was originally only out in Japan on the Zero label. I didn't think it was a great record, but I liked the vocalist. I liked the songs. It was a nice record. Didn't carry on. There was no follow-up to that. I think the biggest problem with Michael Schenker has been, at least in the recording studio, is that he hasn't found another Robin McAuley the way he found Robin McAuley back in the day. And I think Schenker does his best work paired with a terrific vocalist who writes. So, I mean, the proof is in the pudding with that, because Phil Mogg, Gary Barton, Robin McAuley.
Yeah.
There you have his meat and potatoes of his career. 3 guys that wrote well, sang well, and gelled well with him. And he's never been able to find that. So, we could, again, elongate this and go on a crusade against how good these records could have been and weren't. But I don't really want to do that. Just my personal opinion. Obviously, if people like these records, I'm not saying they're the worst thing ever. It's just that this is a guy that captured magic 3 or 4 different times throughout his career, maybe more than that, and hasn't captured that magic, at least in the recording studio. I've seen him countless times live over the last 20 years, and in the last 4 or 5, 6 years, he's better now than he was probably in the 90s live. But in the recording studio, he has not captured any magic, in my opinion, for the last 20 plus years. And I don't know who manages his career. I don't know who has the input, but he severely needs a frontman, vocalist, songwriter to gel and bring out the best in him, because I think he still could put it forth, but it just doesn't seem the right combination. There's no Robin McAuley surfacing. And the interesting about Robin McAuley is, too, I've never understood why he's never, after all these years and touring so exclusively and extensively with McAuley over the better part of the last decade, how the two of them haven't put out a record or even gotten, a unit together as a touring unit. But that hasn't happened, and I don't know why. Maybe we need to get Robin McAuley on the phone.
That's right. Maybe we can get him on in a future episode of the podcast. Much like we did with our previous discography podcast when we did the Europe one, we kind of did a top, me and Tom did our both top, albums by that we just talked about, by that particular artist. So, of course, we did it again, and we're going to run through our top 7 albums in order of number 1 to number 7, most favorite to least favorite. Do you want to start with that one, Tom?
Yeah, I'll start with that. Number 1, I have, in my opinion, it's easy. It's the second album, which was just called Michael Schenker Group, Msg. That name's been used quite a few times in his discography, but the second album from 1981 is my all-time favorite. Number 2, I have Assault Attack, which that album was an Assault Attack, and that's number 2. Number 3, Perfect Timing. I voiced my opinions on how great I thought that record was. Number 4, Built to Destroy. Number 5, M.S.G. the 1992 Michael Schenker record. And number 6, The Debut. And number 7 would be Save Yourself.
So now, much like the Europe discography, where we were really close, and a couple albums flip flop back and forth, but we're pretty far apart on this one. Only because, and I explained this to you earlier, for me personally, because Perfect Timing was the first album that I became sort of aware of Michael Schenker's, recorded history, so to speak. I kind of almost in my top 7 listing put it together in like two parts, almost like a subset. So I started with, for me, my number 1, Michael Schenker, Macaulay Schenker album is Perfect Timing. It's the album I was introduced to the band on, and I love that album. For me, number 2 was the M.S.G 1991 album with Robin McAuley. Number 3 was Save Yourself. So again, you see me with the McAuley albums right there, 1, 2, 3. And then I go to number 4, the self-titled second album, Msg. Then number 5, I would go with the Michael Schenker Group debut, 1980. Number 6, I'd go with Assault Attack. And then number 7, I'd go with Built to Destroy. So we're definitely different, but that's cool. That's all right. And we want to hear, for everybody there out listening to this, to say, hey, what are your favorite albums or your favorite album of the 7 that we just talked about? So we want to hear from everybody and let us know. Comment on our Facebook page or on the YouTube page and let us know what you guys think.
Well, I think that the old school Michael Schenker fans may Assault Attack you about Assault Attack.
That's right, yeah.
But for those of you who don't know, I'm assuming a lot of people that do listen to us know us, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that don't. There's 11-year age difference between myself and Mark, me being the senior of the two. So we grew up in somewhat different eras. Well, we did grow up in different eras. 11 years would be a generation. So a lot of times our tastes are lean toward what we grew up on. And certainly Michael Schenker is a guy that has spanned the globe in terms of 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. So Mark's list, I guess, leans more toward what he grew up on. My list probably is somewhere mixed in between.
Definitely, yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, that pretty much brings us to the end of this episode. We hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, please follow along on our Facebook page. Follow us and subscribe to us on the YouTube page so that you guys can get notified when new episodes get posted. We're trying to stick to a weekly schedule with new episodes. And we hope you guys enjoyed this discussion about the Michael Schenker sort of abbreviated discography. But again, please let us know what you guys thought. Let us know your thoughts on your favorite Michael Schenker Group albums. And that's it for this episode. So we'll see you guys soon with another one. Bye.
Adios.